There's a lion in the desert with a man's face, and no one can explain how it got there. Well, that's not quite true. Egyptologists will tell you they know exactly how it got there. Pharaoh Khafre, around 2550 BC, ordered his workers to carve it from the bedrock near his pyramid using copper chisels, stone hammers, and royal ambition. Problem solved, case closed, next monument please. But if you stand in front of the Great Sphinx today and squint past the tour groups and the souvenir stands, something about that story starts to itch like sand in your shoe. The monument is 73 meters long, roughly the length of a football field, and 20 meters tall, about the height of a 6-story building. It carved entirely from a single block of limestone, not assembled, not built up in sections, but carved directly from the living rock of the Giza Plateau. It weighs hundreds of tons and somehow emerged from the plateau as if the rock had always wanted to be a sphinx and just needed someone to chip away the extra bits. Now imagine doing that with a copper chisel. Copper is soft, softer than the limestone it's supposed to cut. And if you've ever tried to carve a Thanksgiving turkey with a butter knife, you understand the engineering challenge here. And yet, according to mainstream archaeology, gangs of laborers armed with these Bronze Age equivalents spent years hacking at the bedrock, guided by priests and architects. If you ask how they managed to keep the proportions accurate across 73 meters of stone without blueprints, laser levels, or even proper steel tools, the answer tends to be something along the lines of they were very determined, which is a nice way of saying we don't actually know. But here's where it gets strange. The Sphinx has been repaired many times throughout Egypt's long history. Various dynasties noticed the monument crumbling and decided to patch it up, which sounds like responsible stewardship until you look closely at those repairs and realize they're clumsy, misaligned, almost amateurish. The limestone blocks they added don't fit flush with the original body. The joints are uneven, the edges rough, as if whoever did the restoration work was trying to copy something they didn't quite understand, like watching someone try to fix his Swiss watch with duct tape and optimism. And that's the thing that should make you pause. If the Sphinx was carved by Khafre's workers in 2550 BC, then the people who repaired it centuries later were also Egyptians, heirs to the same techniques, the same knowledge, the same cultural tradition of monumental stonework. So why do their repairs look like the work of amateurs compared to the original? Did they somehow forget how to carve stone properly in the span of a few hundred years? Or were they trying to replicate something that had already been beyond their understanding when they inherited it? Modern surveys of the Sphinx reveal something else that complicates the official story. The cuts are clean, straight, precise in ways that shouldn't be possible with primitive percussion tools. Some researchers have noted marks that look more like saw cuts than hammer bruises, which raises uncomfortable questions about the technology supposedly available to Bronze Age workers. And before you ask, we're not talking about ancient aliens here, just the uncomfortable reality that the standard narrative doesn't quite explain the physical evidence staring us in the face. The mainstream response is usually to double down on the local quarry argument. The Sphinx sits right next to Khafre's pyramid and Valley Temple, and the stone clearly came from that exact spot on the Giza Plateau, so therefore Khafre must have built it. But this is a bit like saying the Eiffel Tower must have been constructed by whoever owns the cafe nearest to it, because after all, proximity proves ownership. Except proximity doesn't prove anything except proximity. So what are the alternatives? One theory suggests that the ancient engineers possessed some kind of stoneworking technique we've since lost. Maybe they used vibration to fracture the rock along precise lines, or maybe they had some kind of chemical process to soften limestone temporarily, carving it like clay before it hardened again. It sounds like science fiction, sure, but it would explain the surgical precision far better than the 1,000 guys with copper tools model. History is littered with lost techniques we don't fully understand, like Greek fire, Roman concrete, Damascus steel. Why should ancient stoneworking be any different? Another idea is the Sphinx is far older than the 4th dynasty, possibly carved as early as 11,000 BC, back when the Sahara wasn't a desert, but a place of seasonal rains and green valleys. Proponents point to erosion patterns on the Sphinx's body that look suspiciously like water damage rather than wind erosion. This would place the monument thousands of years before the rise of dynastic Egypt, back in a time when a very different climate and possibly a very different people occupied the Nile Valley. If that interpretation is correct, the Sphinx wasn't built by the Egyptians at all, that it was already there when the Pharaohs arrived, a relic from an earlier, unnamed civilization, that Khafra and his successors didn't carve it, but instead inherited it, claimed it, rebranded it, and when it started to fall apart, they did their best to patch it up, even though they had no idea how it was originally made. This theory doesn't make you popular at academic conferences because suggesting that ancient Egypt might have been preceded by something older, something organized and capable enough to create monumental architecture, tends to get you politely escorted out of the room. Tenure boards don't reward speculation, they reward adherence to accepted timelines, peer-reviewed orthodoxy, and a firm belief that history began exactly when we say it did. This is a version of history we've been taught, neat, linear, and comfortable. In that version, the Sphinx is just achievement of a civilization we understand of Bronze Age, but stand in front of the monument long enough and the cracks start to show, and through those cracks you start to glimpse something else, something older, something we've forgotten or never knew. What you've seen is only the beginning, the first glimpse into the mysteries of the Sphinx and the truths obscured for decades under Zahi Hawas's watch. Share your thoughts and doubts in the comments before we move deeper into this investigation. The further we go, the stranger it gets. If you've ever looked at a photograph of the Sphinx and thought something seemed off, but couldn't quite put your finger on it, you're not alone. The monument has that uncanny valley quality where everything looks almost right, but somehow wrong at the same time, like a portrait, where the artist got the eyes just slightly too far apart, and once you notice it, you can't stop noticing it. Its head is too small, not charmingly small, not artistically stylized small, but mathematically small. Proportionally, the Sphinx's head is only about 2/3 the size it should be for a body that massive. When you map out the body of the Sphinx, the symmetry lines and the scale of the original carving suggest that the head should be roughly 50% larger than it currently is. The torso was clearly planned for a bigger head, which means either the original builders were spectacularly bad at planning their own monument, or the head we see today isn't the head that was originally there. Then there's the resemblance to Khafra, which is one of those claims that sounds authoritative until you actually look at the evidence. The argument goes that the face of the Sphinx matches surviving statues of Pharaoh Khafra, particularly the famous diorite statue housed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. But when researchers have done detailed 3D scans and facial mapping comparisons, the match is tentative at best and non-existent at worst. The proportions don't align particularly well, the facial features diverge in key areas. Honestly, after 4,500 years of erosion even on the protected head, claiming you can positively identify a specific pharaoh's face is like claiming you can identify a specific person from a blurry photograph of their shadow. It's a Rorschach test masquerading as science, and what people see in the Sphinx's face often says more about what they want to find than what's actually there. Perhaps the current head is a recarving of something older and much larger. the Sphinx originally had a different head entirely, probably a lion's head proportionally appropriate to the leonine body, and that at some point, possibly during Khafra's reign, possibly earlier, possibly later, someone decided to recarve that head into human form. This would explain the smaller scale perfectly. You can't add stone back, you can only take it away. So if you're reshaping a lion into a pharaoh, you're necessarily working with less material than you started with. It would also explain the different weathering patterns between the head and the body. The recarved head would be newer stone with freshly exposed surfaces that hadn't endured the same millennia of erosion as the untouched body. And here's the darkest possibility. What if this recarving happened more than once? What if Khafra wasn't the first to reshape the head, just the most recent in a long line of rulers who each chiseled away a little more of the original form, smoothing it, humanizing it, making it more familiar and less frightening with every generation? Every restoration removes more evidence of what came before. Every preservation effort is actually an erasure, until what we're left with is something so far removed from the original that we can't even imagine what it once looked like. The Sphinx becomes a palimpsest, written and rewritten so many times that the first text is completely lost. By now, you should be feeling a particular kind of discomfort, the realization that the most iconic face in all of ancient Egypt, the face we associate with timeless wisdom and eternal mystery, might be the biggest forgery in archaeological history. Not a modern fake, but an ancient one, a deliberate act of cultural appropriation carried out in stone 4,000 years ago. If the Sphinx's face isn't what it seems, then whose face was there before? What truth was carved away to make room for the lie we've been looking at all these centuries? If they were willing to rewrite the face of the most important monument in their kingdom, what else were they willing to change? The face isn't the only thing that doesn't fit the Sphinx. There's also a beard, or rather, there was a beard, a long ceremonial pharaonic beard that at some point broke off and ended up, of all places, in the British Museum. Today, one of the most famous fragments of ancient Egyptian sculpture sits there in a climate-controlled display case labeled as the beard of the Great Sphinx, even though it does not actually fit the monument it is said to have come from. The fragment itself is impressive enough on its own terms. Over a metre-long carved limestone with the distinctive braided pattern of a ceremonial pharaonic beard, the kind worn by god-kings to signal their divine authority. It was discovered in the 19th century during one of the many excavations around the Sphinx, and because it was found in the general vicinity of the monument, and because it looked vaguely appropriate for something of that scale, it was promptly declared to be the Sphinx's missing beard. The piece eventually made its way to London, as so many pieces of Egypt did during that era of enthusiastic colonial collecting, where it now sits behind glass, bearing the catalogue number EA63791 and the confident label identifying it as belonging to the Great Sphinx of Giza. The orthodox explanation is straightforward enough. The Sphinx originally had this ceremonial beard attached to its chin as a symbol of divine kingship, because that's what pharaohs wore. At some point over the millennia, probably due to erosion or earthquake damage, the beard broke off and fell to the ground, where it lay partially buried until 19th century archaeologists found it. The existence of this beard fragment, according to mainstream Egyptology, confirms that the Sphinx was always intended as a royal monument, which in turn confirms it was built by Khafra, which validates the entire accepted timeline. But the physical evidence doesn't support it, and this is where the story starts to unravel in interesting ways. When you actually try to match the British Museum fragment to the Sphinx's chin, it doesn't align, the attachment points don't correspond, the angle is wrong, the scale seems off, despite the impressive size of the piece. It's not a matter of erosion having changed the surface enough to make a once perfect fit now imperfect. It's a fundamental mismatch that suggests these two pieces were never meant to go together in the first place. You can see this in the museum's own archival photographs if you know what to look for, which is probably why most visitors don't look too closely. It's easier to accept the label than to question why the pieces don't fit. Then there's the question of style, which is even more damning to the official narrative. The beard fragment doesn't look like 4th dynasty work from Khafra's era around 2550 BC. It looks like New Kingdom work from somewhere around 1500 to 1000 BC, over a millennium later. The carving style, the decorative patterns, the technical execution all point to a period when Egypt was at a very different stage of its artistic development, when sculptors worked with different tools and different aesthetic sensibilities. This is a clear stylistic signature, like finding a Victorian doorknob on what's supposed to be a Roman temple, and then insisting it must be original because it's on the building and it's old. If the beard were truly original to the Sphinx's construction, you'd expect to see evidence of that in the monument itself. When a massive stone beard weighing hundreds of kilograms breaks off from a statue, it leaves marks. Deep fracture lines, stress patterns in the stone, clear attachment scars showing where the piece was joined to the main body. The Sphinx's chin should show dramatic evidence of this traumatic loss if the beard had been there from the beginning. But when you examine the chin area, there's remarkably little damage that would be consistent with such a break. What you do see is evidence of later attachment work, drill holes, and modification to the surface that suggest something was added to the statue long after it was originally carved and then subsequently removed or fell off. This brings us to a possibility that makes mainstream Egyptologists profoundly uncomfortable. The beard was never part of the original Sphinx at all, but was added centuries or even millennia later as part of a deliberate renovation project meant to transform or re-legitimize the monument. The New Kingdom was a period of intense restoration activity at Giza when pharaohs like Thutmose IV and Ramesses II took great interest in the ancient monuments and carried out extensive work on them. But what these pharaohs were doing wasn't pure preservation. It was appropriation, taking ownership of monuments whose origins had already become uncertain even in their own time. Adding a ceremonial beard to the Sphinx would have been a powerful, symbolic act. The beard wasn't just a fashion accessory for Egyptian royalty. It was a direct visual link to Osiris, the god of death and resurrection, and by extension to the pharaoh's own claim of divine authority and eternal life. By giving the Sphinx a beard, later rulers could effectively rebrand it as a royal ancestor monument, something that validated their own legitimacy by connecting them to this ancient and awe-inspiring sculpture. It didn't matter what the Sphinx had originally represented or who had originally carved it. What mattered was what it represented now, in this moment, to these rulers who needed its authority to shore up their own. And here's where the beard becomes evidence of a pattern. If the ancient pharaohs were willing and able to add a beard to the Sphinx to physically modify this sacred monument to serve their political and religious purposes, then what else were they willing to change? We've already established that the head seems to have been recarved from something larger and older. The beard might not an isolated anomaly. It's part of a systematic renovation, a comprehensive makeover designed to transform whatever the Sphinx had been into what later Egypt needed it to be. The archaeological establishment has chosen to resolve this contradiction by simply ignoring it. The beard is treated as if it's always been part of the Sphinx, despite not fitting and being the wrong style from the wrong period, because acknowledging otherwise would raise too many uncomfortable questions about what else might have been added or changed over the centuries. It's easier to maintain the fiction of an unchanged, eternally Egyptian monument than to admit that what we're looking at is a palimpsest, layer upon layer of modifications and claims and rewritings, each generation changing what came before to suit their own needs. The beard in the British Museum isn't just a fragment of carved limestone. It's evidence that the Sphinx we see today might be several versions removed from whatever was originally there, that the face we think we know might be the result of multiple recarving campaigns over thousands of years, each one chipping away a little more of the original truth. And if the pharaohs were willing to reshape eternity itself to serve their political needs, imagine what else they might have been willing to change about the monument they claimed, but perhaps never truly understood. Which brings us to an even more unsettling question. If the face has been recarved and the beard was added later, what did the original Sphinx look like? The most compelling alternative theory, and the one that makes the most sense of all this conflicting evidence, is that the Sphinx began as something entirely different. A full-bodied lioness, probably carved thousands of years before the 4th dynasty, during a period when Egypt's religious symbolism centered on different deities and different concepts of divine power. In pre-dynastic and early dynastic Egypt, the lioness was a potent solar symbol associated with goddesses like Sekhmet, who represented both protective and destructive forces, the fierce heat of the sun, the savage defense of cosmic order. A monument depicting a complete lion would have made perfect sense in that religious context, embodying powers that were elemental, feminine, and older than pharaonic authority itself. But as Egypt evolved into a centralized kingdom dominated by male pharaohs who claimed divine status for themselves, those older goddess symbols became problematic. A lioness monument spoke to power structures that predated and potentially superseded royal authority, suggesting that there were forces in the cosmos that didn't answer to kings. So at some point, perhaps during Khafra's reign or perhaps later, during the New Kingdom restoration projects we know occurred, someone made the decision to humanize this ancient monument. They carved away the lion's face and replaced it with human features, literally erasing the feminine divine and replacing it with masculine pharaonic authority. It wasn't just vandalism or renovation, it was ideological transformation carved in stone, a gender reassignment of divinity itself. In a world without mass media, without photography or video, physical monuments were how you projected power across time and space. If you could take the most impressive, most ancient, most mysterious monument in your kingdom and literally put your face on it, you effectively claimed ownership of all that accumulated significance. You became the inheritor and embodiment of everything the Sphinx represented, all its age and mystery and authority, regardless of whether you had any actual connection to its original builders. It's the ultimate propaganda move, rewriting the face of eternity itself to serve your political needs. Conventional Egyptology resists this theory. They claim the Sphinx has always been a portrait of Pharaoh Khafra, carved around 2550 BC as part of his funerary complex at Giza. The reasoning relies on a few key pillars. The monument sits near Khafra's pyramid and valley temple, so proximity suggests ownership. Certain facial features like high cheekbones and calm lips vaguely resemble other statues identified as Khafra. It's the kind of neat, elegant conclusion that gets you tenure, mostly because it doesn't complicate the accepted timeline or require anyone to reconsider their textbooks. But if Khafra really did give the Sphinx his face, if he really did commission this monument as the orthodox story claims, then you'd think he'd at least mention it once. You'd think somewhere in all his inscriptions, in all the careful records the Egyptians kept of every important act of construction and devotion, there'd be one line, one phrase that he built the most impressive monument of his age. But there isn't. The ancient Egyptians wrote everything down. They carved their achievements on temple walls, commissioned papyrus records of military campaigns, left detailed accounts of construction projects. When Pharaoh Sneferu built his pyramids, he left inscriptions. When later pharaohs erected obelisks or excavated tombs or built temples, they made absolutely certain everyone knew about it, both their contemporary subjects and whatever future generations might come across their works. But Pharaoh Khafra left nothing, not one hieroglyph, not one papyrus fragment, not one wall carving in any of Khafra's extensively documented building projects that says anything remotely like, "and then we carved the Sphinx." His valley temple bears his name, his causeway, his mortuary temple, his satellite pyramids all have documentation linking them to his reign. But the monument that supposedly bore his own face, the sculpture that would outlast and outshine everything else he built, that one goes completely unmentioned in every record we have from his time. The mainstream archaeological explanation for this conspicuous absence involves a lot of hand-waving about erosion and the vagaries of historical record survival. The inscriptions must have existed, they argue, but were lost to time, worn away by wind and sand, vandalized by later dynasties, or simply degraded beyond recognition. Some scholars suggest that perhaps the Sphinx was considered part of the same overall pyramid complex project, and therefore didn't need separate documentation. What we're being asked to accept is that a civilization famous for its obsessive documentation, a culture that left us thousands of administrative papyri and tens of thousands of inscriptions, somehow neglected to mention building the Sphinx. And not just neglected, but comprehensively failed to mention it in any context that survives from Khafra's actual reign. And here's what makes the silence even more pointed. Khafra's inscriptions do exist for everything else. He documented his temple dedications, his ritual activities, his divine authority. He left statues bearing his name and face. He made certain that his accomplishments were recorded for posterity in the same way every pharaoh before and after him did. So this wasn't a ruler who was modest about his achievements or careless about documentation. He understood the importance of written records and used them extensively. He just never once claimed the Sphinx. There are really only two reasonable explanations for this silence. Either the Sphinx wasn't built during Khafra's reign, which would explain why he didn't claim it, or it was built during his reign, but for some reason he chose not to claim it. It raises the fascinating question of why a pharaoh would commission the largest sculpture in Egypt and then never take credit for it. Neither option supports the mainstream narrative particularly well. If the monument was already standing when Khafra came to power, then his silence makes perfect sense. You don't claim to have built something that already existed. What you might do instead is build around it, incorporate it into your complex, use its ancient presence to enhance your own authority, but you wouldn't risk the obvious lie of claiming to have carved it yourself, when presumably plenty of living people knew it had been there for generations or centuries before you. This theory finds support in the archaeological record once you stop assuming the Sphinx was built by Khafra and start looking at the evidence without that presumption. Khafra's Valley Temple and Causeway do indeed incorporate the Sphinx into their layout, but in a way that suggests accommodation rather than planning. The temple doesn't align perfectly with the monument, and the causeway makes an awkward bend to get around it, which would be strange if everything was designed as one integrated project from the beginning. It looks much more like someone building around an existing structure, trying to make the best of a monument that was already there and couldn't be moved. Perhaps the silence around the Sphinx's construction wasn't accidental neglect or the simple loss of records, but deliberate suppression. The early dynastic pharaohs knew perfectly well that the Sphinx predated their kingdom, that it was a relic from an earlier people or culture that didn't fit comfortably into the narrative they were constructing about Egyptian history and divine kingship. If the Sphinx represented beliefs or powers that challenged or contradicted the pharaonic ideology, then the simplest solution would be to appropriate it, claim it, through proximity and integration, but never explicitly state a claim that could be contradicted by surviving oral traditions or knowledge. Maybe Khafra knew he didn't build it and chose not to make a false claim. Maybe the priesthood suppressed knowledge of pre-dynastic monuments that complicated the official narrative. Maybe the Sphinx's true origins were already lost to time, even in the 4th dynasty, leaving Khafra no claim to make because no one really knew where it came from. Or maybe the Sphinx was deliberately left unclaimed because claiming it would have required explaining it, and explaining it would have revealed truths about Egypt's past that those in power preferred to leave unspoken. When history is written by victors, as the saying goes, they make certain their victories are recorded. But what happens when the victors encounter something they didn't create, something that predates their victory and challenges their narrative? Sometimes they destroy it, sometimes they appropriate it, and sometimes perhaps they simply stay silent, let the monument stand but never speak its name, never acknowledge what it might represent about a past they'd rather forget, or a predecessor they'd rather not admit existed. But silence, as it turns out, isn't permanent either, because while Khafra never claimed the Sphinx, someone else did eventually try to claim it, or at least claim credit for restoring it. Between the paws of the Sphinx sits a granite slab covered in hieroglyphs, and it tells one of the most audacious stories in ancient Egyptian literature. According to the inscription, a young prince named Thutmose was out hunting in the desert around 1400 BC when he decided to rest in the shadow of the great monument, which at that time was buried in sand up to its neck. While sleeping there, the Sphinx itself appeared to him in a dream and spoke, promising him the throne of Egypt if he would clear away the sand and restore the monument to its former glory. The prince woke, recognized this as a divine mandate, did exactly as the dream commanded, and subsequently became Pharaoh Thutmose IV. The stela was erected to commemorate this miraculous event and his dutiful response to divine will. It's the kind of story that reads beautifully in textbooks and museum placards. Egyptologists generally treat the dream stela as exactly what it claims to be, a restoration decree that proves later dynasties venerated the Sphinx and sought to preserve it. It's harmless propaganda, a story about duty, destiny, and the eternal relationship between pharaohs and gods. Except when you look closely at the stela itself, when you examine not just what it says, but what it doesn't say, and what it may have said before. The inscription never suggests that Thutmose built the Sphinx, or that any of his ancestors built it, or that anyone in the New Kingdom had any idea who originally carved it. Instead, the text explicitly treats the monument as already ancient, already mysterious, already half buried in sand by the time Thutmose encountered it. By his own account, he's restoring something old, which means that even in 1400 BC, over 1,000 years after Khafra supposedly built the Sphinx, there was apparently no surviving tradition or record that connected any specific pharaoh to its construction. Think about what that means for a moment. The Egyptians maintained king lists going back to the First Dynasty. They preserved chronicles and records of major building projects. But somehow, for the single most impressive and recognizable sculpture in their kingdom, they had no attribution. The monument was just there, had always been there as far as anyone knew, mysterious and ancient, which rather undermines the confident modern assertion that Khafra built it around 2550 BC, because if that were true and well documented, you'd expect Thutmose to mention it, to frame his restoration as honoring the work of a great predecessor. Here's what most casual readers of the Dream Stela don't know. Thutmose IV wasn't the designated heir to the throne. Egyptian succession normally went to the eldest son of the pharaoh's principal wife, and Thutmose wasn't that son. He was a younger prince who, under normal circumstances, would never have become pharaoh. But then he had this miraculous dream in which the most ancient and sacred monument in Egypt personally selected him for kingship. And wouldn't you know it, shortly thereafter he somehow ended up on the throne anyway. The dream stela isn't just commemorating his restoration of the Sphinx, it's providing divine justification for what was probably a contested or irregular succession. This is brand management masquerading as piety. When you lack the traditional legitimacy that comes from being the proper heir, you manufacture a different kind of legitimacy by claiming direct divine intervention. The gods themselves chose you, bypassed the normal succession, spoke to you personally in a vision that no one else can verify or contest. It's a brilliant political move. But the dream stealer's political usefulness doesn't stop with legitimizing Thutmose's rule. It also accomplishes something more subtle and more significant. It allows him to claim ownership of the Sphinx without having to explain where it came from. By framing his relationship to the monument as one of divine appointment and restoration rather than construction or inheritance, he sidesteps the uncomfortable question of who actually built the thing. He becomes the Sphinx's champion and protector, linked to it through divine will rather than through any traceable historical connection. Now here's where it gets really interesting. The surface of the dream stealer shows clear evidence of earlier inscriptions that have been deliberately erased. Modern imaging analysis reveals marks where older text was chiseled away to make room for Thutmose's narrative. What is clear is that something existed before Thutmose's text, something that was deemed necessary to remove before the new text could be added. What did those earlier inscriptions say? We don't know for certain, but the possibility they contained information about the Sphinx's actual origins, details that didn't fit the narrative Thutmose wanted to promote. Perhaps they named different pharaohs or different gods in ways that would have complicated his claim of personal divine selection. Perhaps they were from an even earlier restoration effort by a previous ruler who Thutmose wanted to supersede. Or perhaps they were truly ancient texts that predated the historical period entirely, remnants of whatever culture originally carved the monument. Whatever those erased lines contained, someone decided they needed to go, that Thutmose's version of events should replace whatever story was told before. This isn't restoration, this is revision, the physical act of overwriting history in real time. It's the archaeological equivalent of editing a Wikipedia article to remove citations you don't like and replacing them with ones that support your preferred narrative. And the text itself, beyond just claiming divine selection, subtly reshapes the Sphinx's religious identity. Earlier references to the monument often associate it with Horemakhet, Horus of the horizon, a solar deity with roots in pre-dynastic Egyptian religion. But Thutmose's inscription increasingly emphasizes the connection between the Sphinx and the pharaoh's own authority. The monument not as an independent divine entity, but as something that exists to serve and validate royal power. The Sphinx stops being a god and becomes a god's endorsement of kingship, a subtle but significant theological shift that subordinates the monument's ancient mystery to contemporary political needs. The pharaoh acknowledged its antiquity and power while simultaneously bending it to serve your purposes. He told a new story that positions you as the rightful inheritor of whatever the monument represents, even if you have no actual connection to its origins. And he did it so skillfully that future generations accept his version of events as the truth because it's literally carved in stone. The dream stealer teaches us something crucial about how history gets written and rewritten. When the facts are inconvenient or missing, authority doesn't admit ignorance. It manufactures legitimacy through other means. When earlier inscriptions contradict your narrative, you erase them and write your own. When the truth is uncertain, you make certainty through the sheer confidence of your storytelling, through the permanence of granite and the unverifiable nature of dreams. And once that rewritten version is established, it becomes the truth that future generations inherit. The Sphinx stops being whatever it originally was and becomes instead a reflection of whoever currently controls the narrative, a mirror that shows not the past, but the present's preferred version of the past. But there are some things not as easily rewritten as the lines on the dream's stela. Nature has left its own evidence on the monument itself. The Sphinx's body carries a record of its own history, written in the patterns of erosion, in the way water and wind have shaped its surface over millennia. And that geological evidence tells a story that's far older and stranger than anything Thutmose could have dreamed. Starting with the rain. The Sphinx sits in a desert that receives maybe an inch of precipitation per year, has for thousands of years the kind of arid climate where wind and sand are the dominant erosive forces. Wind erosion creates horizontal striations, shallow pitting, and a characteristic weathering pattern that you can see on monuments all across Egypt. Sand abrasion leaves its own signature, a kind of smoothing and polishing effect on exposed surfaces combined with undercutting at the base where wind-blown particles concentrate their impact. Both of these erosion types are well understood, easily recognizable, and present on various structures throughout the Giza Plateau. But the Sphinx's body doesn't show wind erosion patterns, it shows something completely different. Deep vertical channels running down the torso and sides, rounded and smooth, in a way that speaks to water flowing over the surface for extended periods. These aren't shallow scratches or surface weathering. They're profound grooves carved into the limestone by rainfall and runoff, the kind of erosion you get from sustained exposure to a humid climate with regular, heavy precipitation. It's the same pattern you'd see on limestone outcrops in tropical or subtropical regions where seasonal rains shape the rock over centuries and millennia. This observation isn't new or particularly controversial from a geological standpoint. When geologist Robert Schoch examined the Sphinx in the early 1990s, he identified these erosion patterns immediately and dated them based on what we know about North African climate history. The last time the Giza Plateau experienced the kind of sustained rainfall necessary to create this type of erosion was during the African humid period, roughly between 9000 and 5000 BC, when the Sahara wasn't a desert, but a landscape of seasonal lakes, grasslands, and scattered forests. Before that, there were even earlier humid periods stretching back to the end of the last ice age, around 11,000 BC, when melting ice sheets and shifting weather patterns brought regular monsoons to North Africa. So if the Sphinx's body shows water erosion rather than wind erosion, and if the type of water erosion present requires thousands of years of exposure to rainfall, then the monument must have been carved when Giza's climate was much wetter. It might date to at the very earliest 3,000 to 8,000 years before the 4th dynasty, before anything that conventional Egyptology is willing to acknowledge as capable of creating monumental architecture. The mainstream response to this geological evidence has been remarkably consistent. Ignore it where possible, dismiss it as misinterpretation where necessary, and when all else fails, attack the credentials of whoever presents it. The official position remains that the erosion was caused by wind and sand, even though it does not look like it. Or perhaps there were anomalous rainfall events during the historical period that could account for the weathering, or that the limestone in question has unusual properties that made it weather differently than other limestone in the same location under the same conditions. None of these explanations withstand serious geological scrutiny, but they have the advantage of preserving the accepted timeline. And the evidence isn't limited to the Sphinx's body. The walls of the enclosure around the monument tell the same story, but with additional detail that makes the rainfall hypothesis even more compelling. The erosion patterns on these walls show clear stratification, with the deepest and most pronounced weathering at the lower levels gradually becoming less severe as you move up toward the top. This is exactly what you'd expect from water erosion, where rainfall and runoff concentrate at the base and gradually diminish in intensity as you move higher. More tellingly, when you compare the erosion on the Sphinx and its enclosure to the erosion on nearby structures that we know were built during the 4th dynasty, the difference is dramatic. Khafra's Valley Temple and the other Old Kingdom buildings show the characteristic horizontal weathering patterns you'd expect from 4,500 years of wind and sand exposure. The Sphinx shows something completely different, something that speaks to a much longer exposure period under very different climatic conditions. If everything was built at the same time using the same limestone from the same quarry, this differential erosion shouldn't exist. But it does, and its presence is a fact that the standard chronology simply cannot account for without abandoning the claim that Khafra built the Sphinx. When Robert Schoch presented these findings in the early 1990s, the response from the Egyptological establishment was swift and hostile. He was publicly dismissed as a geologist who didn't understand archaeology, despite the fact that he was making geological observations about geological phenomena that had implications for archaeology rather than the other way around. Field access for follow-up research was restricted or denied. Egyptian authorities accused him of damaging the nation's reputation and undermining the achievements of Egyptian civilization. It was as if acknowledging that something might be older than previously thought could somehow diminish, rather than deepen, our appreciation for the richness and complexity of human history in the Nile Valley. This reaction tells you something important about how invested the archaeological establishment is in maintaining the existing timeline. Evidence that supports the standard chronology is welcomed and amplified. Evidence that contradicts it, no matter how solid the methodology or how qualified the researcher, gets treated as an attack on the entire edifice of knowledge rather than as a normal part of scientific inquiry. The goal stops being to understand what actually happened and becomes instead to defend what they've already decided happened. But the geological evidence doesn't stand alone. There's another kind of record that can't be rewritten or censored, another witness that's been watching longer than any human civilization. The stars themselves. And when you look at how the Sphinx is oriented and what it's facing, you start to see patterns that connect the monument to the same ancient period suggested by the erosion data. The Sphinx faces due east directly toward the point where the sun rises on the equinoxes. This is often cited as evidence of Egyptian solar worship and doesn't seem particularly remarkable until you start thinking about which constellation rises with the sun at the spring equinox, because that constellation changes over time due to the precession of the equinoxes. The Earth's axis wobbles in a slow cycle that takes roughly 26,000 years to complete, which means the zodiacal constellation visible at sunrise on the spring equinox gradually shifts through all 12 constellations over that period, spending about 2,160 years in each one. Currently, we're transitioning from Pisces to Aquarius, which is why you hear about the age of Aquarius in pop culture. 2,000 years ago, at the time of Christ, it was the age of Pisces. 4,000 years ago, during the heyday of ancient Egyptian civilization, it was the age of Aries. 6,000 years ago, it was the age of Taurus. And somewhere between 10,500 and 8,000 BC, during exactly the period when the geological evidence suggests the Sphinx might have been carved, the constellation rising heliacally with the sun at the spring equinox was Leo. And the Sphinx, when it sits facing east watching the sunrise, would have been looking directly at its own celestial counterpart, the lion in the sky, mirroring the lion carved in stone on earth. This could be a coincidence, except that the Giza Plateau seems to be full of these astronomical alignments that all point to the same general period. The three pyramids match the configuration of the three stars in Orion's belt, but not as they appeared in 2500 BC during the 4th dynasty. They match the configuration as those stars appeared around 10,500 BC, the same era indicated by the Sphinx's orientation toward Leo. The layout of the entire site, in other words, seems to be a mirror of the sky as it appeared during a specific epoch, one that predates conventional Egyptian history by thousands of years. Either this is an extraordinary series of coincidences, or someone was designing these monuments with astronomical knowledge and intentionality that we've systematically underestimated. And if they were encoding astronomical alignments that pointed to a specific period in deep history, the obvious question is why? What were they trying to memorialize or communicate by freezing a particular moment in the sky's precession cycle into monumental stone? One possibility is that we are looking at cultural memory encoded in architecture, a way of marking time not through words, which can be lost, but through the motion of the stars. If you wanted to leave a message that would survive even if your language or civilization disappeared, aligning monuments to the heavens would be a reliable way to do it. The stars keep time on scales that dwarf human history, and by anchoring your architecture to them, you create a message anyone with astronomical knowledge can still read, no matter how much time has passed. But this raises uncomfortable questions about who possessed that astronomical knowledge in 10,500 BC or thereabouts. According to conventional history, humans at that time were still living in small hunter-gatherer bands, had not yet developed agriculture or permanent settlements, and were at least 5,000 years away from building anything that could reasonably be called monumental architecture. The idea that people in that era could conduct precise astronomical observations and execute engineering projects on the scale of the Sphinx or the Great Pyramid of Giza pyramids contradicts essentially everything we think we know about the progression of human civilization. And yet the physical evidence exists. The erosion patterns suggest extreme age. The astronomical alignments suggest intentional design, encoding a specific ancient date. The monuments themselves demonstrate engineering sophistication that in some ways exceeds what later Egyptian dynasties achieved. Either all of this is meaningless coincidence and the geological evidence is somehow being misinterpreted, or we need to seriously reconsider what was happening in North Africa during the period when the Sahara was green. There's a term for that era in climate history, the African humid period. Sometimes it's called the Holocene wet phase, when increased summer solar radiation shifted the monsoon belt northward and brought regular rainfall to regions that are now desert. This wasn't a brief anomaly, but a sustained climatic pattern lasting thousands of years. During that period, the Sahara supported megafauna like hippos and giraffes, had extensive lake systems and river networks, and would have been perfectly capable of supporting substantial human populations. Archaeological evidence from this period is sparse because subsequent desertification has buried or destroyed much of it. But what evidence we do have suggests that people living in North Africa during the humid period were more sophisticated than we typically credit. Cave paintings from this era show detailed knowledge of animal behavior, suggest some form of cattle domestication or management, and in some cases depict scenes that imply organized social structures. Stone circles and megalithic structures from this period, such as those found at Nabta Playa, indicate astronomical observation and ceremonial activity. The absence of evidence for cities or writing shouldn't be mistaken for evidence of absence of a complex culture. There are many ways to be sophisticated that don't leave the same archaeological footprint that urban civilizations do. The Sphinx and possibly the core structures of the Giza Plateau were created by people living in a very different North Africa than the one we know during a period when the climate supported the kind of sustained population density and resource surplus necessary for monumental building projects. This isn't pseudo-archaeology or wild speculation. It's a hypothesis that accounts for the physical evidence better than the standard chronology does, that resolves rather than ignores the contradictions we've been documenting throughout this investigation. The rain carved its body over millennia of exposure. The stars framed their gaze according to a celestial configuration that hasn't been visible for 10,000 years. Both the earth and the heavens are telling the same story, one that doesn't fit our textbooks but fits the evidence better than anything else. And that story suggests that the Sphinx isn't just old, it's a survivor from a period of history we've barely begun to investigate, a witness to civilizations that rose and fell before the civilizations we study even existed. While you're staring up at what time and nature have written on the Sphinx's body, you might miss what lies beneath your feet, because the most closely guarded secret of Giza isn't carved into the stone, it's buried under it. Multiple independent teams using different technologies have detected it, mapped it, and published their findings in peer-reviewed journals. Ground-penetrating radar shows anomalies consistent with hollow spaces. Seismic surveys reveal voids where solid bedrock should be. Electromagnetic imaging detects rectangular cavities beneath the monument's pores and behind its haunches. The data is consistent, repeatable, and unambiguous. There are chambers down there, almost certainly man-made given their regular geometry and strategic placement, and they've been sealed and undisturbed for an unknown period of time, and nobody is allowed to look inside them. For over 4 decades, various teams of researchers have requested permission to conduct exploratory excavations or even simple fiber optic camera inspections of these voids. But the Egyptian authorities who control access to the site have found reasons to deny, delay, or restrict those requests. The official position has evolved over time but always arrives at the same conclusion. There's nothing down there worth investigating, and even if there were, investigating it would be inappropriate for reasons that vary depending on who's asking and when. In the early 1980s, Dr. Thomas Debicki and researcher John Anthony West conducted seismic refraction studies around the Sphinx enclosure. Seismic surveys work by sending sound waves into the ground and measuring how they reflect off different materials and structures. Solid rock produces one signature, air-filled voids produce another, and you can map what's beneath the surface by analyzing the patterns. Debicki's team identified 2 significant anomalies: a rectangular void directly beneath the Sphinx's front paws and a larger chamber-like structure behind the statue's rear haunches. Both showed characteristics consistent with deliberately excavated spaces rather than natural geological formations. The findings were intriguing enough that other teams wanted to replicate them, and in the 1990s, a Japanese archaeological expedition from Waseda University brought more sophisticated equipment to Giza and conducted their own surveys. Using electromagnetic imaging technology, they detected the same anomalies Debicki had found, plus additional voids in the bedrock around the Sphinx enclosure. Their data suggested a network of tunnels or chambers beneath the monument, some natural, but others with geometric regularity that implied human construction. The Japanese team published their results and requested permission to drill narrow boreholes for fiber optic camera inspection of the voids, a minimally invasive technique that would allow them to see what was down there without damaging the monument or requiring major excavation. Permission was denied. The official explanation was that drilling even small holes near the Sphinx could compromise the monument's structural integrity, despite the fact that similar techniques had been used successfully at other Egyptian sites, and that the proposed boreholes would be smaller in diameter than a pencil. The Japanese team persisted, offered to use even less invasive methods, provided additional documentation about safety protocols, and got nowhere. Eventually they gave up and went home, leaving behind their data but no answers about what that data actually showed. And this has been the pattern ever since. researchers detect anomalies, publish their findings, request permission to investigate further, and get stonewalled by a combination of bureaucratic inertia and official dismissal. The explanations for why investigation can't proceed have varied over the years, but they always lead to the same outcome. Initially, the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities simply denied that any chambers existed, claiming the radar and seismic data showed only natural fissures or geological noise. When additional surveys kept detecting the same features, the position shifted to acknowledging that there might be voids but insisting they were natural erosion pockets of no archaeological significance. It's the bureaucratic life cycle of truth playing out in slow motion: deny, deflect, minimize, and above all, never actually check, because checking might reveal something inconvenient. And the person who embodied this approach for decades was Dr. Zahi Hawass, who served as Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities and effectively controlled archaeological access to all major Egyptian sites. Hawass became famous for his media savvy, his passionate defense of Egyptian heritage, and his categorical rejection of any theory that challenged orthodox chronology or suggested foreign involvement in ancient Egyptian achievements. When it came to the hidden chambers beneath the Sphinx, Hawass's position was consistent and contradictory in equal measure. In public statements and media interviews, he dismissed the chamber claims as fantasy, pseudo-archaeology promoted by people who didn't understand geology or wanted to believe in lost civilizations. He ridiculed researchers like John Anthony West and Robert Schoch, accused them of trying to damage Egypt's reputation, and made it clear that no serious Egyptologist gave credence to their theories. But in less public contexts, Hawass acknowledged that the radar showed voids. They appeared to be chambers, and it would be interesting to know what was in them. When asked why he didn't authorize investigation if he acknowledged the chambers existed, his answer was always some variation of, "We already know everything we need to know," or "It's not a priority given our limited resources," which is a remarkable position for an archaeologist to take. The entire purpose of archaeology is to investigate the unknown, to dig up what's buried, to answer questions about the past by examining physical evidence. When you encounter chambers that have never been opened beneath one of the most famous monuments in the world, chambers that might contain artifacts or inscriptions or anything that could shed light on the monument's origins and purpose, the normal response would be excitement and immediate plans for careful excavation. Instead, we get decades of deflection and obstruction, as if the greatest archaeological discovery in generations is somehow less important than maintaining whatever narrative is currently convenient. There's a legend, or maybe a myth, that's become attached to the Sphinx chambers over the decades, and while it's impossible to verify, it's worth mentioning because it explains why so many people have been so persistent in demanding investigation. Edgar Cayce, the American psychic known as the Sleeping Prophet, claimed in the 1930s that he had visions of a hall of records hidden beneath the Sphinx. It's a library or archive containing the accumulated knowledge of a lost civilization that predated Egypt. According to Cayce's trance readings, this civilization had been destroyed by catastrophe, but left behind records of their achievements and wisdom, sealed in chambers beneath the monuments they'd built as markers for future generations to find. His Hall of Records prediction did something interesting. It motivated serious scientific investigation. When Debicki and West went to Giza with their seismic equipment, they were partly following up on Cayce's claims, trying to determine if there was any physical evidence for chambers in the locations he'd described. And they found something. Not because Cayce was necessarily right about what was down there, but because the chambers turned out to actually exist, regardless of how anyone heard about them. The legend brought researchers to the site, the researchers brought proper instruments, and the instruments detected real anomalies. But the Casey connection also made it easier for authorities to dismiss the whole thing. By linking the chamber research to psychic predictions and New Age mysticism, they could avoid engaging with the actual geophysical data. Anyone asking questions could be painted as a crystal-waving conspiracy theorist instead of a legitimate researcher following up on real evidence. It's a convenient deflection that's been used repeatedly to shut down serious inquiry without having to address the substance of what's been detected. So why has the Egyptian government been so determined to prevent investigation of chambers if they're really just empty natural voids of no significance? There are several possible explanations, and they're not mutually exclusive. The most charitable interpretation is that the authorities are genuinely concerned about structural damage to the Sphinx and believe that any excavation, no matter how careful, poses unacceptable risks to the monument's stability. This is a legitimate concern, and preservation should be a priority, but it doesn't explain why even non-invasive investigation methods like fiber optic cameras have been rejected, or why the same authorities who block chamber exploration have authorized other work on and around the Sphinx that seems at least as potentially risky. A less charitable, but perhaps more realistic explanation is institutional inertia and academic pride. The official timeline is set, the textbooks are written, the tourist industry is built around a particular narrative of Egyptian history, and anything that threatens to overturn that narrative threatens careers, reputations, and economic interests. If the chambers beneath the Sphinx contain evidence of a sophisticated pre-pharaonic culture, then suddenly every Egyptologist who's spent their career defending the orthodox chronology has a problem. Every museum exhibit needs revision. Every tour guide needs a new script. The entire structure of how we understand the development of civilization gets called into question. And it's not just academic reputation at stake. Egypt's national identity is deeply tied to its pharaonic past, to the narrative of Egyptian civilization as one of the fountainheads of human achievement. The tourism industry, which is crucial to Egypt's economy, depends on presenting ancient Egypt as the product of specifically Egyptian genius, the achievement of the ancestors of modern Egyptians. If the Sphinx and possibly other Giza monuments are the work of an earlier, unnamed culture that the Egyptians inherited rather than built, then that disrupts the nationalist narrative in uncomfortable ways. Better to leave questions unanswered than to risk answers that complicate the story you've been telling about yourself. There's also the possibility, darker and harder to prove, but consistent with the pattern of behavior we've seen, that some people in positions of authority actually know or strongly suspect what's in the chambers and have decided that information needs to remain sealed. We can't know for certain which of these explanations is closest to the truth without actually investigating the chambers. And that's the real mystery here, more significant in some ways than whatever artifacts or empty spaces might exist beneath the Sphinx's pores. The mystery is why an institution supposedly dedicated to uncovering the past has become the primary obstacle to discovery. The mystery is how archaeology became about protecting conclusions rather than testing them. The mystery is why the people who claim to want to understand ancient Egypt most are also the ones most determined to prevent anyone from looking in places where understanding might be hiding. The hidden chamber isn't just beneath the pores of the Sphinx, it's in every denied permit, every dismissed researcher, every official statement that ends inquiry rather than encouraging it. And in that conceptual chamber, in that space of unknowing, lives a possibility that explains everything we've seen. The Sphinx, and perhaps pyramids at Giza, are remnants of a civilization that predated pharaonic Egypt by thousands of years, a culture that left no writing we can read, no cities we've excavated, nothing but their monuments and the silence that surrounds them. Every civilization tells itself a creation story. The Romans descended from Trojan heroes. The Aztecs emerged from 7 caves in a mythical homeland. Modern nations trace their founding to revolutionary moments frozen in historical amber. These stories matter because they define who we are by explaining where we came from, and more importantly, they establish us as the beginning of something rather than the continuation of something else. Ancient Egypt had such a story too. They called it Zep Tepi, the first time, an epoch when gods walked the earth and raised the first temples. Mainstream scholarship treats this as pure mythology, poetic language expressing religious concepts rather than historical memory. But what if the Egyptians were telling a deeper truth than we'd been willing to hear? What if Zep Tepi wasn't myth but cultural memory, the distorted echo of an actual predecessor civilization that the Pharaohs inherited from, built upon, and eventually claimed as their own? The physical evidence we've examined so far suggests exactly this. And if we follow that evidence without loyalty to comfortable narratives, it leads somewhere most archaeologists refuse to go. The Sphinx is the work of a culture we have no name for, no certain knowledge about beyond the monuments they left and the silence surrounding them. The standard narrative presents human history as steady progression from primitive to sophisticated, from scattered hunter-gatherers through agricultural villages into the first civilizations around 6,000 years ago. In this telling, ancient Egypt represents one of humanity's earliest experiments with complex society, emerging gradually from Neolithic farming communities into the world's first unified state. But Egypt doesn't follow this script. The civilization appears almost fully formed at the beginning of the historical period, already possessing sophisticated architecture, astronomical knowledge, writing, and engineering capabilities that wouldn't be matched for millennia. Djoser's Step Pyramid, built around 2650 BC, and technically the first major pyramid, is already a massive, precisely engineered stone structure. Just generations later, the Fourth Dynasty builds the Great Pyramid with such precision that its base is leveled to within centimeters, despite covering over 5 hectares. The learning curve is missing. The crude prototypes and failed experiments you'd expect from a civilization developing these capabilities from scratch simply aren't there. Orthodox archaeology assumes we haven't found that developmental evidence yet, that it existed but remains undiscovered. There's another explanation that fits better. The early Egyptians inherited these capabilities, building on knowledge and techniques passed down from an earlier culture that had already solved these problems. This would explain something that's always been puzzling about Egyptian civilization, how it seems to start at such a high level and then in many ways decline rather than progress over time. The Old Kingdom pyramids are more precisely built and better engineered than the later pyramids. The hieroglyphic system is more sophisticated and complex in the early periods than it becomes later. It's as if Egyptian civilization began with inherited excellence that it spent the next few thousand years trying to maintain and eventually failing to reproduce, rather than starting crude and improving over time, as you'd expect from a culture developing these capabilities organically. Egyptian texts themselves preserve hints of this inheritance. The concept of Zep Tepi appears repeatedly in religious and historical records, referring to a primordial epoch when gods walked the earth and the first temples were raised. Academic consensus treats this as symbolic mythology, but the distinction between myth and memory isn't always clear. Cultural memories can survive for thousands of years, distorted and mythologized, but still preserving echoes of actual historical periods. The followers of Horus appear in king lists and texts as semi-divine rulers who preceded human pharaohs, who built the original temples and established the principles of kingship. Their consistent appearance in otherwise historical documents suggests they might represent actual people whose achievements were so impressive that later generations elevated them to divine status. Various texts reference the builders before time, masters of stone who shaped eternal monuments before writing, before recorded history, before the flood that Egyptian tradition preserves alongside many ancient cultures. Are these memories of the Sphinx's builders? Definitive proof is impossible, but the pattern is suggestive. A civilization that created impressive monuments but left no writing, whose existence preceded the historical period, who were associated with an age before catastrophe, before the climatic changes that transformed North Africa from green to desert. That description fits what the geological and astronomical evidence suggests about the Sphinx's origins far better than it fits the 4th dynasty pharaohs. But if such a culture existed, where are the cities, the tools, the pottery, the graves? This question gets treated as decisive, the reason to dismiss pre-dynastic complexity outright. If an advanced culture existed in North Africa 11,000 years ago, we should be finding their artifacts everywhere. Since we're not, they must not have existed. Case closed. Except the absence isn't as definitive as it seems. First, we haven't looked that hard. The Nile Valley and surrounding desert contain hundreds of sites never properly excavated, areas dismissed as natural formations based on surface surveys that can't detect what lies meters below. Archaeological work in Egypt has historically focused on the dynastic period because that's where the impressive monuments and royal tombs are, what gets funding and media attention, what museums want. Pre-dynastic sites without obvious monumental architecture get classified as minor and left for future investigation that often never comes. Second, the time period and environmental context wouldn't necessarily leave traces we're trained to look for. If this culture existed during the African humid period when the Sahara was green, and if their settlements were along river valleys and lake shores that no longer exist, subsequent desertification would have buried everything under meters of sand or eroded it away entirely. Then there's the catastrophe itself that fundamentally changed North Africa's climate. The end of the last ice age brought rapid climate fluctuations, rising sea levels, flooding coastal settlements, and shifting monsoon patterns that eventually turned the green Sahara into desert. This wasn't gradual but abrupt, a series of transitions that would have destroyed agricultural systems, eliminated water sources, and forced massive population displacements. A thriving culture in 11,000 BC could have been completely disrupted, its survivors scattered and forced to abandon their settlements, their knowledge partially lost as they struggled to adapt to radically changed conditions. Catastrophe erases not just lives but memory, particularly when it destroys the physical places and objects that anchor cultural continuity. If the Sphinx was carved before this climate catastrophe, if it survived because it was bedrock that couldn't be moved or destroyed, then it becomes a bridge between two eras, a remnant from before the flood that later cultures encountered, tried to understand, and eventually claimed without knowing its true origins. This reframes how we understand human history. Civilization stops being linear progression and becomes recursive instead, cyclical, with periods of achievement followed by collapse, followed by slow rebuilding that sometimes reaches earlier heights and sometimes falls short. The Sphinx stops being a marker of Egyptian achievement and becomes something more sobering, evidence that we've lost entire chapters of human history, that people built impressive things and understood complex truths and then vanished so completely that even their names didn't survive. The ancient Egyptians looked at the Sphinx and couldn't explain who built it. They created stories, tried to claim it, gave it a beard, and carved a new face. Now we look at the Sphinx with the same ignorance. We've created different stories, assigned it to Khafra based on proximity and institutional inertia, defended that assignment with authority rather than evidence. We're no closer to the truth than Thutmose was when he dreamed his way into connection with something already ancient and mysterious in his own time. Perhaps that's precisely the point. The Sphinx wasn't built to memorialize a specific ruler or express a particular theology. It was built to outlast whatever catastrophe its builders sensed was coming, to serve as a question mark carved in stone that would survive the climate change and the collapse and the forgetting. It sits there in the desert staring east, daring every subsequent civilization to wonder what it means and who made it and what they knew that we've lost. We are not the first to look at it and feel small. The Pharaohs felt that too, explaining why they tried so hard to make it theirs, to overwrite its mystery with their narratives, but the Sphinx outlasted them, just as it's outlasted everyone else who tried to claim or explain or reduce it to a comfortable footnote. It sits there still, weathered and damaged and silent, with a face that might not be original, and chambers beneath its paws we're not allowed to investigate. All that makes it more perfectly suited to its purpose as a reminder. We don't know as much as we think we know. History is deeper and stranger than our textbooks admit. There are questions we can't answer, no matter how sophisticated we become. Perhaps the Sphinx guards something more important. The memory of those we made disappear. The knowledge that civilizations can be forgotten, the warning that what happened to its builders could happen to us. The unnamed civilization might not have left us their name, but they left something more valuable. The reminder that we're not the first and won't be the last, that knowledge can be lost and recovered and lost again, and that sometimes the most important inheritance is awareness that there's more to remember than what we've been told. We began this investigation standing before a monument, asking a simple question: who built the Sphinx? At the end, we're still standing there, but what we see has changed. The lion with the human face hasn't moved, but the certainty surrounding it has crumbled like the limestone patches later dynasties used to repair what they couldn't recreate. The next time you encounter a historical fact presented with institutional confidence, remember the Sphinx. Remember that proximity isn't proof, that silence can be more revealing than inscription, that the absence of questions often means someone decided the answers were inconvenient. Every field has its sphinxes, mysteries wrapped in consensus, questions buried under decades of repetition. You don't need credentials to notice when evidence doesn't match the story. You don't need permission to ask why. The greatest threat to comfortable narratives isn't academic rebellion, but ordinary curiosity that refuses to be satisfied with unsatisfying answers. If this video changed how you see one monument, imagine what else might shift if you applied the same skepticism elsewhere. History isn't finished being written. It's being rewritten right now every time someone looks at old evidence with new eyes and refuses to accept that the conversation is closed. The builders left us a question. What we do with it is up to us. If this investigation resonated with you, consider subscribing. Hit the like button if you found value here. It helps this reach other people who ask inconvenient questions. Drop a comment with your thoughts, your own theories, or the historical mysteries you'd like to see investigated next. And if you know someone who'd appreciate this kind of deep, skeptical look at what we think we know about the past, share it with them. Curiosity spreads better when it's not alone. The Sphinx waited thousands of years for someone to ask the right questions, but your next mystery doesn't have to wait that long.